Hello, everyone. Good crowd. We're excited to have with us Siddharth Chatterjee. He is the United Nations resident coordinator to Kenya. He's been on the show before, including being one of the first 50 guests on the show. We're excited now to have him as one of the last 50 guests on the show. This is going to be a great conversation. You do not want to miss it. Stick around.
Welcome to the Your Mark on the World show with your champion of social good, Devin D. Thorpe.
Our sponsor, Johnson & Johnson, matches most individual donations up to $250 at caringcrowd.org. Sid, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Devin.
It's a thrill to have you back. It was my honor to meet you in Kenya in person a couple of years ago, as well as having had you on the show. You're an extraordinary guy. I love your feminism, your passion for doing good in the world, your leadership. It's great to reconnect.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Devin.
Sid, let's just talk for a moment about the rising population in Africa. That sounds like a scary thing, but you point out that there's real potential in that. Talk about that dilemma of the population.
Right. So, Africa is what you would term is in a demographic transition. Let me give you an example of Kenya, for example. Kenya's population was 7 million in 1956. That was the same population as Sweden. Sweden's population today is 10.9 million, and Kenya's population is 46 million. And by 2030, Kenya's population will go to 65 million, and 2050, Kenya's population will go to about 100 million. By 2050, Africa's population, which is currently at about 1.1 billion, will go to about 2.3 billion. And of this, there'll be about 850 million young people. And to put that into further context, over 70% of Kenya's population is less than 30, and that applies mostly to most countries of Africa. So you're seeing what is termed as the youth bulge in the real sense, and this is what Western Europe saw in the post-Second World War, or the Asian tigers saw in the late 50s, early 60s. So it's called a demographic transition, and it's a natural aspect of demography. But the demographic dividend is where the greatest opportunity can be reaped, and which basically means, Devin, that we have to make sure that we invest in what I would term as the 4 E's. The first E being the education and skills in this population, which means we need to create an army of skilled workforce, from the plumbers to the masons to the PhDs to the doctors to the engineers, but you need the entire focus to be developed on the skill sets that they need. The second is empowerment, and empowerment particularly focused on women and girls. For example, Sub-Saharan Africa alone loses about $95 billion every year because of gender inequality. The third is employment, and employment is going to be crucial. If you want an Africa to thrive and be prosperous, you want everybody to be employed, and that is precisely why UNICEF and the World Bank, led by the UN Secretary General, led by Henrietta Fore of UNICEF, have all come together and said we need a generation unlimited, where you have every young person who's in training, in school, or is gainfully employed. And the fourth is equity. And equity is going to be crucial because, when you have people left behind or left out of the development curve, that's when instability happens. So if you see this large migration and refugees fleeing conflict, fleeing climate change, fleeing deep pockets of poverty, fleeing bad governance, they do so because they have very few choices and very few opportunities left here. However, if we were to make those investments in those 4 E's, Devin, the sky is the limit, because that is precisely what, if you look at the Marshall Plan of the United States post-Second World War Europe, what it did was it turned Europe into it took Europe out of poverty. It turned Western Europe into a huge market for the United States and a whole new group of allies. Now, Europe, the US, the Asian tigers still need markets. The new markets are here. So which means that you have to invest in Africa to make it make it prosperous. And if you look at the pattern of Western Europe or the Asian tigers, they grew rich before they grew old. The median age of Sweden, for example, is 47. And as I mentioned, the median age of Kenya is 18. I see it as a huge demographic opportunity, huge markets, which can actually be transformative and yet maintain the quality of life that Western Europe and the Asian tigers and the US have. But the other side of it is, it could be a demographic disaster if people start to flee exactly those same reasons that I mentioned. There are 35,000 African youth looking for work every day. There are 10 to 12 million African youth looking for work every year. They need to find employment. And I think those opportunities lie here. Look, I mean, it's a continent of immense potential. Just a few statistics, if it's helpful. The agriculture sector alone would be $1 trillion industry in Africa by 2030, which is just 11 years from now. The health business here would be about $300 billion. The affordable housing space could be anywhere from $700 to $800 billion. The blue economy, which is the oceans, the rivers, the lakes, all of it put together, is going to be about a $5 to $7 trillion economy by 2030. So the potential opportunities are massive. It's a matter of how the West, how the world comes together to respond to developing precisely the way Western Europe developed post-Second World War. So we need a Marshall Plan of the same ambition to come to Africa. I see enormous potential here.
So Sid, as you think about those investments, that some of that money has to come from outside Africa for a variety of reasons, right, in part because Africa doesn't have all the resources it needs to invest in all of that. But how would you guide investors to make investments in the infrastructure, the public works, the companies, the businesses, in such a way that they have a win-win effect for the investor and for the people of Kenya, and don't become extractive like some of the investments that have been made in diamonds and other natural resources in Africa that have really just extracted value from Africa without really benefiting Africans?
So let me give you an example of Kenya. I think the strides that Kenya is making in terms of pulling its people out of poverty, it's already migrated into a middle income status country. It's got enormous human capital. It's got enormous natural resources. And what it has is 3 Ps that have aligned, which is political will, the right public policies, and a range of partnerships. Now, the part is the partnerships part. And this is where we need to see a new way of doing business, which is to crowd in blended financing, more foreign direct investment. Take, for example, your own pension fund, Devin. It probably makes 1 to 2% in terms of movement and return. Whereas here in Kenya, for example, if you were to invest $1,000 into a fixed deposit, it has a velocity of 7 to 8%. Now, that's what an emerging market is all about. What we as the UN family are doing are looking at ways of precisely that, of how do we attract blended financing? How do we open up countries like Kenya towards more foreign direct investment? So we are working with the government in terms of the public policy so that if they go into the ease of doing business, they are able to make legislative changes that makes investments easier and less loan reliant. The political will is there. I think the president of this country, Uhuru Kenyatta, has demonstrated enormous political will. His Big Four agenda on affordable housing, food security and agriculture, universal health coverage and manufacturing is actually primed towards the overall sustainable development goals, the 17 goals. And what we need to do is finance this. The SDGs alone need between $2.5 trillion to $5 trillion a year to finance it. I believe Africa, through progressive liberalization of their markets, the free trade agreement, for example, that the African Union has pulled together is a remarkable landmark deal. It's like Africa wants to be the future European Union, which allows the free movement of goods, services, and people to take place. We are actually seeing this happen. So the UN in Kenya, for example, has provided what is called a UN public-private partnership in partnership with the government of Kenya. I co-chair it with the government. And basically what we have is different elements of the private sector that come together, and we co-create with the government to look at big bankable projects that can have impact. And this is not about doing 5 villages or 10 villages. This is how do we impact the lives of millions of people? And as the UN Secretary General constantly reminds us that, leave no one behind, but reach the furthest behind first. This is precisely what we are trying to do. We are getting into the furthest counties to transform, to make the periphery the center. And that is what we are attempting to do in terms of these public-private partnerships. We've tested it out, Devin, recently in the last 3-4 years with 6 companies: Merck, GlaxoSmithKline, Safaricom, Huawei, Kenya Healthcare Federation, and Philips. And there was an investment of about $15 million made into 6 of the remotest counties to bring down maternal mortality ratios. In 3 years' time, the maternal mortality ratios dropped to 1/3. The team got an invitation to the World Economic Forum in Davos. Deloitte did a report which was launched by the current Minister of Health in New York. So that potential is there. Kenya is proving to be a microcosm of what the potential is for the rest of Africa. And we've seen it happen.
As you think about the youth in Africa, especially the youth in Kenya, what would you say to them who feel frustrated, lacking in opportunities? How would you encourage them to change their own circumstance? Do you see opportunities? How would you guide them?
It's massive. The opportunities are massive. And that's precisely why the UN thought it prudent to appoint President Kenyatta as a global champion, as a global leader on the Generation Unlimited. It is to unlock the unlimited potential of this generation of Africans. It's President Kagame, for example, of Rwanda, who's doing absolutely spectacular work in that area. What we need to do is ensure that those enabling environments that I spoke to you about the 4 E's: education and skills, their empowerment, making sure that women join the workforce and they are equal, they are able to plan their families. The primacy of sexual reproductive health and rights is going to be crucial. Why is it that the Asian tigers or Western Europe progressed? It's because the family sizes were manageable. There was better disposable income. Once the microeconomic picture starts to improve, the macroeconomic picture improves. This is precisely what we are trying to do. Make sure that women have complete rights. From the time a girl child is born, she must be allowed to achieve her full human potential. That's how they will contribute productively to the economy, because we know that anytime there is a dual income in the household, it improves the prospects of the household. That is why employment is necessary, and the entire range of employment. I mean, take agribusiness, which I mentioned is a $1 trillion economy. The reality is that in Kenya, for example, the median age of a farmer is 62, whereas the median age of the country is 18. How do we get more and more 18-year-olds into the farm? And that will happen when we bring the convergence of big data, technology, and innovation, really leapfrogging it. Young people really embrace technology. They embrace innovation. Kenya is a hotbed of innovation. I just think the potential here, as we are moving towards these sustainable development goals of 2032, to me, Kenya can actually be a blueprint of what Africa's development model can look like. But we need to make the world realize that these are countries into which you can invest. That is why the United Nations family is providing such a platform, so we de-risk and ensure that companies feel absolutely confident that they have a multilateral structure which is in support of them. This is precisely what the Kenyan government is trying to do. And, I think some of the landmark initiatives in this country which have taken place have actually given a reason for hope. There is the youth, it is only when despondency and hopelessness creeps in, then you have issues of pockets of instability. You have the scourge of violent extremism. You have terrorism. They're all, pegged to the bottom reality of the lack of dignity, which comes from the absence of jobs and the sheer hopelessness and the deep poverty. We can change that. And if we have to change it with a model, the old traditional model of an aid is not going to work. You want a model which brings in bankable public-private partnerships. It creates jobs. For the youth, the most important thing is to have a job. And I think once it starts with that, it starts with their own personal dignity and a sense of self-worth. Now, whether the person is working as a plumber or a mason or an engineer or a scientist, we must define the term of dignity of labor. Perhaps a plumber in the United States of America makes a little more money than many other vocations. It's because that's a requirement, because everybody needs plumbing. That's precisely why we have that dignity of labor. A plumber could be sitting next to a brain surgeon, and they could be sharing a drink and not thinking about each other's jobs as being very different. That is precisely what we need. So I think we are making that movement as the UN family. We have 23 United Nations agencies here, which have signed a UN Development Assistance Framework with the government of Kenya, which is from 2018 to 2022, fully aligned with the government's priorities, and to make sure that we achieve, and youth and gender are actually pegged in the centrality of what we are trying to do. This is what will make a difference, Devin. And it's work in progress. While I may sound optimistic, let me tell you, I have reasons to be optimistic. I'm already seeing the trajectory of Kenya. I've seen some major successes in this country. I think there's a lot that we could actually achieve. There are key things that we have to stay focused. We need to stay focused on what the president has termed as his Big Four agenda. We have to stay focused on delivering as one. That is why the Secretary General has initiated a UN reform. And we have to be fit for purpose. It was Alvin Toffler who wrote The Future Shock, who said, the illiterate of the future are not those who cannot read and write, but it's those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. This is what we are doing, adjusting, adapting to the new reality of how can we make sure that Kenya not only achieves the sustainable development goals, but can actually bring itself up to a country of prosperity. In my view, 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and I can wager a bet on it. Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania could potentially be double-digit economies in the next 5 to 10 years, so long as we make the right microeconomic and macroeconomic change. Over to you.
That's great. Sid, as you look back at your time in Kenya, what are you most proud of having accomplished?
My proudest moment is being, working with the First Lady of Kenya, who has really invested a lot of political capital in the reduction of maternal mortality. As you mentioned earlier in the program, I am a feminist, and my work in the UN Population Fund was really to focus on reducing the maternal mortality ratios. Kenya was amongst the 10 most dangerous places for a woman to give birth, simply because they would die of postpartum hemorrhage or HIV or hypertension. That has changed dramatically. In fact, the maternal mortality ratio in this country when I came in 2014 was at about 488 deaths per 100,000 live births, which has dropped to 360. Now, in many countries, this would take 10 to 15 years to happen. And we've seen this happen in some of the most difficult, hard to reach, violence-prone, conflict-prone, cross-border terror-prone counties. And, those are the counties where we've seen these real results. The second thing that I'm really proud of is Kenya and Ethiopia signed an MOU led by the heads of state of Kenya and Ethiopia in 2015. It was the first of its kind cross-border program in an area called Moyale, which had seen internecine conflict between 35 clans and of that area. In a matter of 3-4 years, life has changed quite dramatically for them. It is not that the conflicts have ended. We have to keep a focus on the peace. But it responds to what the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, constantly talks about, the triple nexus of prevention, of peace, of humanitarian action, and of development. And we are seeing what the peace dividend is bringing in a place which actually used to have internecine conflict, large number of young people that used to go and join violent extremist groups. That has dropped exponentially. And it's been classified by the UN University of Japan as a global best practice. On the 12th of September, 2019, President Kenyatta and President Museveni signed a similar agreement for the Karamoja area between Kenya and Uganda. So to me, these are very proud moments simply because UN has been seen as an integral part of this important political initiative. And what we are doing is bringing together our collective capacities to make a transformational difference.
Excellent. Sid, what is your superpower?
In what sense, Devin?
What makes you so successful?
Well, I think it's first and foremost is tenacity. You have to believe in it, Devin. It has to be being optimistic, being tenacious, bringing people together, but also understanding that there is a certain amount of risk that needs to be taken. And people talk about managed risks and calculated risks. Sometimes it's a leap into the unknown too, which we did, for example, in the northeastern counties, and it had major returns. So I think it's a combination of these factors. But the most important thing is How do we align really well with the government's priorities and have a relationship of trust, confidence, and the government firmly believing that as a UN family, we do believe in ensuring that they achieve their development objectives. We are able to pull people out of poverty. We are able to end food security, ensure end hunger and ensure food security. We are able to make sure that people have universal health coverage. We are able to make sure that people have the right education and skills. And we are able to make sure there's gender equality. Those are the first 5 goals of the SDGs. That's the unfinished business. That's why we are putting a particular focus on.
Fantastic. Well, Sid, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I know you've got to get off to the airport, but before you go, would you take just 1 minute and tell people how they can learn more about your work in Kenya and how they can connect with you on social media?
Absolutely. So my social media handle is at SidChat1, which is at SIDCH81. And of the UN family, it is at UN Kenya, which is at UNKENYA. And you'll find us on if you just browse UN Kenya, you'll find us there. We're doing a lot of interesting work, and we are thrilled that we have a political capital and a political movement in this country, which is really about making sure that Kenya becomes a high middle income or a first world country. And I can see the potential of that being unlocked right here.
Oh, that's great. That's inspiring. Sid, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And we wish you every success in your continued work to improve the lives of the people of Kenya.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you very much.
All righty. Let's do some good.
Let's do some good. Bye-bye.
At Caring Crowd, we believe everyone has the power to make a difference. Through our crowdfunding platform for community health, we empower passionate people to drive real change. Whether you work for a nonprofit organization, volunteer, or want to get involved for the first time, you can post a campaign on Caring Crowd. Join us, because caring is where change begins.
Thanks for tuning in to the Your Mark on the World show, the Social Impact Podcast. Please subscribe via YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or Spotify.